So I'm going to pick up today on some points made yesterday and reflect a bit more upon the ethical, the legal, and the social implications of data integration. We heard yesterday really interesting examples of national data integration, and Chiara and Amani, they spoke to the fascinating work they're doing to facilitate cross-border data integration. And really, they're not alone. We are investing billions of euros in cross-border data integration. So then Kaya came, and he gave us food for thought in terms of thinking about how biobanks can now also be used to facilitate types of research very different from what people might have imagined when they donated their samples, where what we used to think of as social determinants of health were turned around and used as data points for which we would be looking for genetic dispositions for the social categories. Things that people might never have thought about when they signed up as donors. And that should make us think about issues like informed consent in a new way, I think. Not least when Isabel came yesterday and outlined what we can expect from the European health data space, what is probably, the most momentous intervention in the legal framework for health data that we've seen in our time. It makes us all into data holders as well, and thereby also obliged to share for purposes that we might not have imagined when we gathered the data. So I think it's time to think about the ethics of data integration and whether data integration might sometimes produce just a little more than we expected of it. And really, we are seeing so many investments in all of this. We have 186 EMI projects of at least 20 million euros each running up now, just to have cross-border data exchanges of health data. We have, all of that work going into the commercial sector of creating genome browsers, et cetera, which are also forms of data sharing. And just a couple of months ago, there was an article out informing clinical geneticists of the minimum amount of cross-border data sharing databases that they should be aware of to carry out their duties as clinical geneticists. And you can't even read the full list, right? So there's so much happening in this field. And I was recently asked to write up a handbook chapter about cross-border data sharing in healthcare. And as I was trying to compile a list, it got a little wildy. I don't know if you get that feeling when you just don't even know how to categorize it because there are so many types. And it ended up like this. And these are just examples of types. So we have billions of euros invested in making data integrated in new ways. And that should make us think just a moment about what kind of development this is. If you think about it, a century ago when we started to standardizing and outlining how to document medical treatments, if you had told a doctor back then, and then of course after you've written your health record, it's going to be shared globally, they would have kind of laughed and said, oh yeah, that's absolutely ridiculous. How would that ever be useful for anybody else but me? So there's been like a momentous shift, which also means that some of the ways in which we now think about what's natural and good and what we have to do in order to share data for secondary purposes naturally also affect back on the primary purposes and the types of clinical relations people have. So we've seen a really, really grand shift, if we think of it historically, from personal relationships between the physician or the surgeon and the patient to globally integrated systems. From documentation as small, communication devices or memory devices for the individual doctor to issues which keep the individual health professionals liable and for which they should also be responsible for ensuring maximum learning. So all of the secondary uses come out of it. And also we've gone from something which was stored as a little paper narrative to something that is decomposed into data points, diagnostic codes, etc., and which are aggregated at the population level. These are momentous shifts. And of course, it is in this landscape that the European health data space becomes so incredibly important and really worth of all the attention that Isabel suggested yesterday we should give it. The main elements were already outlined yesterday, but I would just remind you that, when citizens are supposed to have immediate access, it depends upon a very integrated health data infrastructure. And if all the health data are to be available for secondary purposes where health data access bodies, service access points, and you can be fined for not sharing your data, then we do need shared data standards that makes it all interoperable. And the Commission has given itself the authority to do these standards. They've also introduced something which I will return to at the end, something quite remarkable by making particular forms of secondary analysis prohibited, which is also a major intervention, I think, in the ethics of health data reuse. But all of this points to incredible levels of integration. And it speaks to what is actually a quite long-standing dream of having access to all the data in one place immediately. Things I think most of us, as it speaks to our researcher heart, like imagine if we had all of it there, I would love it, right? But we also need to think about what it might do beyond the things that we imagine we would like to use it for. And actually, this enduring dream has a long history, which is worth thinking about, because 150 years ago, people would not have thought about all the data from everywhere all at once. They would have thought very differently about data as something that were created for particular purposes. But beginning with the early days of positivism with Auguste Comte and Laplace, we started seeing people imagining, gathering data from everywhere. And the novelist C. Wright Wells wrote in the 19th about, imagine if we had a world brain, that could gather all the knowledge that we already have. And with the inventions in the 1940s, where we started to think about information as something that could be mathematically worked with, actually that gained that old vision a new life, because with the mathematical vision of information, there's like a vision of infinity. You can just have more and more and more. There's always a higher number. It was just as Alan Turing wrote in his absolutely seminal paper outlining the imitation game. Some of you might have noticed the movie about that as well. He made it the notion of artificial intelligence creating a world brain into a matter of storage capacity. It's just a question of being able to gather all the data in one place. But all of this rests on a notion about data as a representation of something which is straightforwardly sitting out there in the world. So a diagnostic code is a diagnostic code is a diagnostic code. That just means diabetes, that kind of disease that it relates to. But that's actually not how data work. Data are locally constructed with particular local meanings. Sabina Leonelli, for example, has really outlined in very great detail why we need to think about the ways in which data only get evidential value for a calculation in case you actually understand the context in which they were produced. It should also make us think, this whole informational view of the world, about how different it is from the original purposes and thereby the context in which data are to make sense when they are produced. And most of us, also in the biobanking world, depend upon access to data created in the clinical context. So there are some things for us to think about here. And some people do not seem to think that much about them. In particular, the whole AI rush And I have good colleagues who are doing what a lot of other people would call AI, and have been doing so for their entire life. And they keep courses in my local department where they say, stop using the word AI, I hate it. Talk about whether it's this type of machine learning or that type of machine learning, but if you talk about it as AI as a thing, you stop thinking about where the data come from, what kind of technologies you use, and they even see, a grant application saying, we're gonna treat the data with AI, as if that was an explanation for what you're gonna do. And so that nevertheless has a lot of popular appeal. And I don't know how many of you who read The Economist, but I was somewhat struck by their special issue about how we would gain from data intensification in healthcare in their March 30th issue, and describing, like we would get self-programming panaceas, as if there were no need for humans at all anymore. But they also had a particular sentence which I thought was striking. They said, what we really need is all the data from everywhere, all at once. This is where I picked my title from. And I don't know if it's just me who actually also happened to see the movie with more or less the same title. Everything, everywhere, all at once. And I thought there was something really striking, about that, because this is a story about a woman who's under deep pressure, having to serve too many masters, and who are drawn into, and that's where the movie gets really, really weird, she's drawn into a form of ontological multiplicity. That is, what she does in one world has implications, life and death implications even, in other worlds. Now, of course, that would have nothing to do with the nice things that we are doing in healthcare, you would say. But actually, I think it has an uncanny resemblance, and that we might need to think about what we do with data in one world has life and death implications for what happens elsewhere. And to outline that, I'll give you some examples from the Danish experience, which is really going deep into how well you can integrate health data resources. And some of the examples that I'm outlining here have already been outlined in my book, Data Paradoxes, which came out on MIT Press last year, and it's open access if you are interested. Because behind the scene, which looked pastoral and all, we have a highly digitized and very digitally well-integrated society in Denmark. Some of you already know. And a lot of the things that we now imagine to have with the European health data space on a European scale is already in place in Denmark. So you can log into your online health services where you have access to all your pharmaceutical prescriptions, your laboratory answers, your medical records, all of these things that are now envisioned for the European level. And this depends on a highly integrated data infrastructure. Using a slide from Statistics Denmark, it also depends on identification measures, and we use the same personal identity numbers for all interactions, not just in healthcare, but also beyond. This was a system with 3 base registry for identification of people, dwellings, and enterprises, which were set in place already in 1968. I don't think EIDAS of the EHDS will come up, and do its work as quickly as we had hoped. It's already so much delayed, but still, once you had it in place, of course you can see why it was there. It was for taxation purposes. That's kind of obvious when you look at it, but once you had it in place, it could be used for all the other things, including integration of healthcare data sources. And that means that gradually data have become like a cog operating in multiple machines at the same time. The same diagnostic code is supposed to be not just, information serving a particular clinical purpose, but a lot of other purposes, because now we have the data. We might as well also use it for this and for that and for that. And all of these purposes means that the same thing is now helping clinicians to serve the purposes of creating health. Policymakers and administrators should be helped to ensure good governance. We have researchers who should be able to produce knowledge. We have industrial partners who should need the data in order to create wealth. All good, laudable purposes, yes. But if you have a cog operating in 4 machines with 4 different outputs, there's sometimes a bit of friction. So I will just give you a few examples. And these examples relate to the way in which integration lead to paradoxes, and this is where the title of the book comes from. That we can tell ostensibly very different stories about what data integration does, which are all relatively true for some people or to different people over time. So when we work with data in a way where we ask them to be present in many different machineries at the same time, the question is no longer just what data mean, is this really diabetes, but also what they are expected to do. Because what they are expected to do in the particular practices in which they are used will have implications for what they can be taken to represent. I'll give you an example. If you go around the wards, hospital wards in Denmark, you will hear a lot of people say quite conflicting stories about what it means to have all the data available. You would have all the voices from everywhere available all at once.
On a fait une sélection là.
Oui, il a que 4 doigts, ouais.
All right. Because we've had a lot of people who don't even enter the ward who would claim to know exactly what's going on in the hospital because we can look at the data. And they would say, we actually have absolutely tightened control of the clinicians now. We know what's going on. But you also have others people saying we have absolutely no clue how to understand the data anymore. And why is that? Well, it's because as we ask people to document ever more for purposes that are not necessarily clinically relevant, what has happened is that the clinical documentation has changed. I'll give you some examples from some interviews that we did. A quality coordinator said, hey, you know, times are changing. People are getting used to having everything out in the open. So if you haven't documented it, somebody will be chasing you down asking for it. And you think, oh, that's good. You know, we have tightened control. We know exactly what's going on. Except, she continues, I actually think you can hide as many things today as you used to be able to. Because you can just produce bad data, you know, invalid data. Then the documentation is there. It's just as if a slippery slope has been opened somehow. You know, that's not an innocent slippery slope. If we don't know what the data mean anymore, that's actually something that is also clinically important and very, very important for our research dependent on these data. A secretary said, you know, our ward has very few errors. And again, you kind of think, oh, that's good. Except, she continued, it doesn't mean we're doing things correctly. We don't have time for that. But we do whatever it takes to keep the system quiet. Now look what that means. It means that you are thinking of yourself not as producing documentation for the sake of the patient, but documentation in terms of what all the other voices might think about you, all the people from afar. And a hospital manager was even more clear. He said, one thing is certain, you become very creative. If you're pressured on something you can't possibly deliver, you cheat. Now, this is actually something which is quite important. It has social and epistemic implications because these processes are undermining data validity. And the former director of the National Health Authority came out some years ago and said, you know, we have to acknowledge that psychiatric diagnostic codes among the young are no longer medically valid. Wow! What on earth happened? How can we go out and say, you know, they're no longer medically valid if we just claim Denmark has integrated all of these amazing resources and they can be used for research? Well, what he said was that increasingly we have municipalities wanting to use diagnostic codes to create good governance. Instead of somebody getting a bit of like extra help in school and others not, we want it to be based on a good and safe system. So we demand a diagnostic code before we give extra support. But then that kind of stretches the diagnostic coding in order to help a 10-year-old with a little extra help in school. But you know what? what helps the diagnostic, the 10-year-old might, to get extra help in school, might not help them later. So we've seen an increase of 72% of the young men being denied access to the military because of diagnostic code accrued during the schooling. So what opens doors at one point closes doors at another point. And the ways in which we expected the diagnostic code to just be a cog that could serve 4 machines no longer serves the research machinery. It no longer serves the clinical machinery in order to try to serve the good governance and administrative machineries. And that means we have to think carefully about what integration of data resources implies, also for how we can use the data when we want to trust the data as actually signifying what we think it does. And just last week, we had another case of what was seen as described in the national broadcasting as a big biobanking scandal. And this was about reuse of newborn screening samples and their health data. When people are born, this blood sample is stored in the clinic, and they decided, oh, it's all there, we might as well use it, right? So we took 100,000 people with diagnostic diseases accrued later in life, with psychiatric diseases accrued later in life, and did GWAS on them, and then 40,000 who didn't have diagnostic psychiatric diagnosis. And that was a lot of nice research, right? Except people hadn't really understood that, you know, you could have had a right to opt out, and is my sample used? And that also means that now we have a major challenge to the legitimacy of biobanking and data reuse in Denmark. But also, remember, they were depending on diagnostic code accrued at a time when the National Board, Director of the National Health Authority says they are no longer medically valid. So we actually have 100,000, 140,000 GWAS compared to data we don't know if they are medically valid. So to conclude, we see enormous investments in data integration and biobank infrastructuring. And this integration turns data into cogs that operate in multiple machines at the same time. Data repurposing thereby has some very epistemologically significant consequences. And the valid data reuse should also depend on actually understanding where the data come from, which is often ignored when you do these big data studies. I think that integration is not just a technical nor a legal change. It is indeed an epistemic, a social, and an ethical one. And in a time where you don't know how your data is going to be reused, we can't keep up using informed consent as a fig leaf, saying, oh, but people consented to this, when we don't know what we're actually asking them to consent to. And I do think, to end on a hopeful note, that with the EHDS and the prohibitions on use, we might start thinking about other ways of protecting the interests of the people on whose support we depend. And on that note, I thank you for your attention.